Please join me in welcoming Keya Chatterjee.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So as we all sit here today, there is a room just like this in Glasgow, Scotland, where delegates from all over the world are sitting at the UN climate meetings at COP26. And today is actually the day off between the 2 weeks of these UN climate meetings, but there's still meetings happening where people are deciding how are we going to land this set of meetings today. And these meetings they're called COP. It's the Conference of Parties, COP. And this meeting that's happening right now is COP26. So think about that. That means that for 26 years, heads of state, ministers from all around the world have gathered to talk about the climate crisis and have chosen every year to not do what we need to do. I don't actually sadly anticipate that this year will be dramatically different, but I do see that we're on a trajectory to make things different. And I think that ultimately the decision we have to make is one that Pope Francis has made very clear in Laudato Si, that has been a very clear moral call. The question is, do we care more about money? Do we care more about fossil fuels? Do we care more about capitalism, or do we care more about people? Do we care more about taking care of each other? And do we care more about justice? And unfortunately, we have a lot of people choosing the wrong thing at every moment along the way. And certainly here we see with the federal government in the United States, we repeatedly over the last 5 weeks have seen a lot of drama where people have made the wrong choice. At every step of the way, lots of people we vote for, people we expect better of, and people who know better, consistently making the wrong choice. But what we also see is an incredible movement rising up to push back, and that gives me an incredible amount of hope. Climate change is an issue that has defined my life in many ways. It's changed my career. I started working on climate change at a very discrete moment of time. It's funny talking to young people because I always feel like when you're reading the bio and it's like 1998 to 2000, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I realized there are probably people here who were not born at that time. But this moment when I started working on climate change, it was one day in 2002. And it doesn't feel that long ago to me, but I was working at NASA headquarters here in DC, and it was a Monday morning, and we had just come in from the weekend, and I was talking to my colleagues and just talking about how the weekend had gone, and some data came in from Goddard Space Flight Center, which is not too far from here in Maryland, and it was Arctic sea ice data. And we looked at it, and we were just looking at it and chatting about our weekend still, and it looked wrong. And we called over on the speakerphone. I was talking to somebody who knew much more than I do about Arctic sea ice. And we called over, and they were like, no, it's right. We checked it 12 times. That's how much Arctic sea ice is left. And that is a strange story to people who work on Arctic sea ice because, in fact, in 2002, we were just seeing these mild blips in Arctic sea ice. And in 2012, we lost a huge amount, so much that we had to change the graphs, and we've seen a dramatic decline since then. Now, that for me was a moment of epiphany. I thought, I have to change my career. And 48 hours later, I had a new job, which was communicating research of climate change. Now, you might wonder why I care so much about ice, or why anyone should care about ice. I'm actually not that passionate about ice. I don't even like cold weather. I'm wearing a down coat, and it's not even cold here. I don't care about ice that much. But what I knew looking at that data was that this is actually not about ice. This is just a signal that people aren't going to have food, that people aren't going to have water, that people aren't going to have homes, that we're going to have more migration because of droughts, that we're going to have floods, that our communities are going to flood. And that, to me, was an unbearable reality to hold and not feel called to do something. So I changed my career that day and began working on this issue. And I very quickly realized that actually this was an issue that was not about communication, even though I changed my career to communicate this. The problem wasn't that the people we were talking to, the members of Congress, the people who held power, the problem wasn't that they didn't know that we were putting humanity at risk. The problem was that they did know. They knew exactly what was going on, and they knew exactly what it required of them, and that it required some sacrifice of them, that it required them to give up these connections to their wealthy donors and to disappoint their wealthy donors that were destroying the planet. And they weren't willing to do it. And that epiphany to me was incredibly important because it led me to change my career again into doing advocacy, into organizing, into talking to people and helping us understand that we actually have an incredible ability to change what is happening. And to get off of fossil fuels. So yes, we have this moral obligation because it is bad here in the United States. For folks who live out west, we had moments this summer where we had 60 wildfires happening at once. We had whole communities burned to the ground and just be ashes. You couldn't even find anything in some communities. When Hurricane Ida came through, the United Homa Nation, indigenous nation in southern Louisiana, was devastated. It was barely even in the news. It did make the news that Philadelphia was flooded. It did make the news, up here in the north, equal devastation. Families living in basements, mainly immigrant families living in housing that was subpar, died in their homes. Their homes were flooded. These are impacts we see. We see derechos in Iowa. We see these incredible impacts in the United States. Unfortunately, we see here in DC, we now have 2 breeding seasons for rats when we used to only have 1 because it's warm longer. We have more mosquitoes. We have, right now at Howard University, students are protesting because there's mold in the dorms, one of the most common observable impacts of climate change here. It feels really bad here, and in fact it is. But it's actually, we don't even see the extent of how bad it is because we often ignore what's happening in the rest of the world. The typhoons, the flooding. There was flooding in Mozambique that was so bad that whole parts of the country were lost, and only 5 helicopters showed up from all over the world to move people from their communities. People were on roofs thinking someone would come, and nobody came. These impacts are everywhere, all over the world, but it is in communities of color. It is in the global south where people are hit first and worst. And that means we have an extra moral obligation because of the privileges we have of living in this country that actually caused most of the problem. Because the actual pollution we're talking about here, it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And we have caused the bulk of it. And that gives us the amazing privilege of being in the place where we can actually solve the problem. And we can do it. So I think that one element of this is, yes, we have a moral obligation. I started this working in this issue when I could easily say to crowds of people, like, we can get on top of this before it gets bad. We can do this right now. We have lost a lot of time, and now we are already, so at these UN climate meetings, there's a cry, 1.5 to stay alive. That's what the small island nations ask for, is that we limit warming to only 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial times. Well, right now, we're already at 1 degree of warming, and we're having these UN climate talks, and the United States government President Biden was there. We had 12 cabinet officials there. We have hundreds of government delegations there. And because of vaccine apartheid, there are at least 6 small island nations that have no government representation at this meeting. These issues really overlap of justice when you see things like that. We have such enormous privilege here in the United States, and we are not using it right now to help those that have most in stake, and we are not seeing the moral elements of the issue here. We actually wouldn't have a climate crisis if we didn't live in a system of white supremacy. And I think that's something that we don't really absorb, how interconnected these issues are. Like, if we were not willing to sacrifice Black, brown, indigenous communities, there would be nowhere to put coal-fired power plants. There would be nowhere to put pipelines like the Line 3 tar sands pipeline that is spilling into wild rice beds right now, that, by the way, President Biden chose to allow to move forward by not revoking the permits that were put forward, that were given by President Trump. If we didn't live in this system of white supremacy, we would not have gone down this route. Back when Jimmy Carter wanted to go to solar, we would have done it. And I think that's an important thing to think about on top of this moral obligation and this moral duty we have to deal with this crisis, is that it's actually simple. We can actually do this very easily. Like, I came from working at NASA. It is not that hard to slap solar panels on things and to put up wind turbines. It is not that hard to have good public transportation. It is not that hard to deal with transit equity. It's actually, relative to the grand scheme of problems, this is not hard. We can do this. And so it comes down to why haven't we done it? And it just comes back to money and power, and a very dangerous alignment of power that we've allowed to take hold in this country between fossil fuel billionaires and white nationalists and people who want us to be in a constant state of war. And that alignment creates a block that's very hard to overcome, but we can do it if we are united and if we have solidarity across issues. And that brings me to what has been happening in DC. And I'm so short, I have to say, I have to stand on my tiptoes every once in a while just to see my time check, in case you're wondering why I have to do this every once in a while. But I just want to talk a little bit about what has been happening in DC for the last 5 weeks. Because there's a lot in the news about it, and I want to tell it from the perspective of 5 young people who were on hunger strike for 2 weeks, for 14 days, and not eating. So who has heard about these hunger strikers? Oh, good. Big. And how many people, heard the call to fast in solidarity with these hunger strikers? Oh, thank you. So I want to give a little bit of, I want to peel back some layers of what's been happening at the federal government level in the last few weeks. I'm going to start with the fact that we, as a society, elected President Biden on a platform to deal with the climate crisis and deal with many other crises that we have. A plan was put forward called Build Back Better. That plan had within it it started as a $6 trillion package. It was pared down to get more votes. At some point, there was a decision, we really need to have a bipartisan way forward. And so a piece of this effort was separated off, and that bipartisan piece was called this infrastructure bill. All the rest of the pieces, child care, college, community college, immigration, dealing with the climate crisis, all of it got put into another bill called the Reconciliation Bill or Build Back Better. These two things got separated. And at a moment of crisis, when people realize we may not be able to get support from this, particularly from a few individuals, from Manchin, Sinema, but also in the House of Representatives, Gottheimer, Rice, Schrader, people who are from places that are absolutely feeling the impacts of climate change, fires in Oregon, flooding in Hawaii. A few people blocking this meant that what the decision was to take a lot of the climate crisis provisions out, to take a lot of the immigration provisions out, to take a lot of the protections out, and in order to get it done. That happens, we don't have the political power we need to deal with justice, and it happens. But then what happened was that we had these brave hunger strikers come forward and say, this is not okay. This is not okay. We want to live, and we want to live safely. And so they began to go on hunger strike. And what we saw at that point is that we began to get provisions back in that we had lost in the Build Back Better bill. And we actually had a lot of members of Congress decide, okay, we are going to have to do these two bills together because the public really demands it, and people are very, very concerned about their futures. And that held for a few weeks. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of deadlines. It's very hard because the press kind of covers what's happening as though it's a game. As though it's a game whether or not humanity will survive. And it is, and it's hard to watch because in fact what's going on is that every single day these members of Congress that you all elect are here having fundraisers every day with pharmaceutical lobbyists, with fossil fuel lobbyists. They're having fundraisers, and at those fundraisers, those millionaires and billionaires are asking them to only do the piece that's easy for them, only do the piece that has highways, only do the piece that is really simple for them in terms of not having to have any sacrifice. And so I was very, very proud of the hunger strikers that that their work was able to make a change here, to bring some pressure, and it really made a difference. And again, all those provisions came back in, but then what we saw on Friday night was that the infrastructure bill passed, and the other provisions did not pass. There was just a promise they would pass in the House, and there's some uncertainty in the Senate. And for me, it was a real moment of having to take 10 steps back and remember what this arc towards justice looks like. This particular struggle we are in right now, I know some of you will have virtual meetings with your members of Congress, some of you might be able to meet in person. This struggle is going to tell us how far along we are in terms of saving humanity, but it is not the entire struggle. And what matters more than anything is our ability to stay in the movement. And I think it's important to realize that there will be people who say, oh, it's petulant. It is immature to demand these things. It is immature not to go with compromise. But I think we also have to remember that we cannot compromise with the physics of the atmosphere. We can't I can't have a debate and say sorry, the politics aren't here, please stop warming. I can't do that. And I think that there's there's this mismatch between our politics and this crisis that we face. And I think we face this with COVID too, to some degree, where it's our politics are we don't want the government to have to step in and make vaccines. But the reality of the situation is that we needed it. We had to do that in order for us to survive. And so I think that we're in a moment where we have to realize that it is going to take all of us together to move forward. And I'm going to say something a little bit challenging and hard here, which is that I feel that if our faith communities had really, in the last decades, been taking forward a message of protecting each other and our planet, we wouldn't even need to have hunger strikers or an environmental movement. But are our schools really teaching Laudato Si? Are we really leaning into the calling to do this? How many people, have a class about Laudato Si or hear sermons about that on a regular basis? That's great. Maybe 5%. That's not enough. And we find ourselves in a very politically difficult situation because of that. We see in the United States what the Pope is saying is not actually being conveyed at the pulpits in this country. The bishops in this country are not conveying that message, which means we don't have the movement we need to have. And until we really bring until we really understand that, like, whatever we want to achieve on any other issue, we cannot achieve if we ignore the climate crisis. If we continue to make this choice, we can't achieve it. If we continue to say money and fossil fuels and in politics is more important to us than doing the right thing, we cannot. We're not going to win on any of our issues. They're all interrelated. And so we need faith institutions to step forward in a different way, because time and time again, and right now, we're right in the middle of this right now. We are seeing the federal government, we are seeing the UN climate meetings fail to move forward because we are not enough in community and pushing this issue as people. And my call to all of you is to do whatever you can to change that. We have incredible power as individuals, but we have so much more power in community. We have incredible power as people who are angry at the system, and I can tell you, I'm angry. I'm angry at Manchin. I'm angry at Cinema. I'm angry at all of these people. I'm really mad. I'm furious, but I'm angry at the president. I'm angry at the president for deciding that bipartisanship is more important than a livable planet and all of our needs. But that anger is going to burn out because you can't stay angry forever. And what's going to stay is community. What's going to stay is love. What's going to stay is my love for the hunger strikers. What's going to stay is my love for my community. What's going to stay is all of our relationships, our friendships, the people we love. Love lasts. So I am very angry right now. I'm so angry that I can't even process how we have landed here. We had this incredible deadline of the UN climate talks. We had incredible motion towards federal action. And right now, we don't have anything in hand. And every time we come to a deadline, we fail. So November 17th is another deadline where oil and gas leases are going to be decided by the president. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure he's going to give more oil and gas leases at a moment where we simply can't afford to do that. People are dying. Like, it is killing people. And of course, we need to, I want to be very clear that, like, we have to have a just transition. The workers in the fossil fuel industry are the ones who have been most abused by this industry. We have to take care of them. We have to take care of communities that are on the front lines. But we also have to stop. We have to stop digging and burning as a way of living. It has to stop. And so I think that the only way really for it to stop is for us to come together and make sure that it stops. And I have absolute 100% faith that we will do it. Because yes, people are already suffering now, but at the end of the day, we cannot not be in this struggle. It doesn't matter how bad it gets. We have to stay in it. There's no point where we can be like, oh, I give up. Because it will continue to get, I use the analogy sometimes of a sunburn. Like, if you're in the sun and you have a sunburn, you have to get out of the sun. If you get sun poisoning and it's worse, you still have to get out of the sun. There's no point at which we can't try to save humanity. Humans will be fine. Humans will exist as a species, but will we save humanity? Will we save music? Will we save love? Will we save community? That is up to us. That depends on what we do. So I'm going to end with the words from the hunger strikers that they left us with as they were leaving town and doing protests against Senator Manchin, which is, I'm going to ask you to repeat after me with each of these phrases. We will live full and beautiful lives. We know what is at stake. We choose to fight together. Thank you.